everybody. This is Lawrence Sabo of Adventists Today, and I'm here today with one of the scholars I have really come to appreciate, and that is Dr. Michael Campbell. And Dr. Campbell has just written another new book about 20th century history of the church. Let's start with that, Michael. Most of our studies about church history go back to the time of the church pioneers, Ellen White and Smith and Andrews and these folks whose names we know. What interested you in the 20th century?
Yeah, great question. And Lauren, first of all, thanks for having me. It's just great to see you and be able to talk for a little bit. Secondly, I guess to respond to your question, for me, Adventism, the first century is absolutely vital, the earliest Adventist pioneers, and that's interested me. But how we've come to interpret Ellen White since her death through the rest of the 20th century, I think is just as important. And so I remember when I first started getting interested in Adventist history when I was just a kid. I was probably 11, 12, 13 years old. And I met in the course of those events, I met C. Mervyn Maxwell, who is the consummate storyteller of Adventism. You may have had him as a professor in seminary.
Oh, yes.
And I just remember as a kid, he challenged me and said, Michael, we really need good Adventist history in the 20th century. And so, and I remember looking up at him. He said, if you really love Adventist history, you should get your doctorate. It's never too early to start working your doctorate. And he urged me and said, Michael, work on a topic in the 20th century. And even though I was just a kid, and of course that interest and love for Adventist history grew over the years. And I did, in fact, work towards my doctoral degree in Adventist studies and so on. That stuck with me. And obviously the topic itself and some of those interests have changed over time, but I'm profoundly grateful for people that have invested in me. And one of those people would be Mervyn Maxwell, and I suspect we would, if he were still alive, he's passed away some years ago, we might even, I'm sure we would disagree on some things, but that's okay. But I appreciate that he was someone that was a visionary, said, hey, here's someone that loves Adventist history, and here's a real lacuna in our historiography. And so it's just kind of naturally flowed into my own research interests as over time.
There is, and perhaps it's a myth, but there is an idea that you hear from rather traditional Adventists that nothing has changed. We're exactly the same church that we were, that the pioneers established, and almost 200 years we are still doing early historic Adventism. I think your friend Dr. Knight probably has refuted that, but your studies would say the same thing. We have evolved, haven't we?
Well, this is what historians do. We study change over time. I don't believe in cyclical history, that everything just kind of repeats itself in an endless cycle. That because life is complex and history is complex, and we're not the same as those pioneers in the past. But we can, by studying their lives and their ideas, we can better understand the past. We can better understand the church and how it's become what it is today. And as a believer, I certainly also appreciate and acknowledge that I believe that God has worked in the past and all of those things too. But I would be the first to also acknowledge, as a scholar, as a historian, that what we look for is to try to understand how change has happened. And yes, the pioneers, and I think George Knight has made this point very ably, that if we were to suddenly go back to the days of the earliest Adventist pioneers, a lot of Adventists today would probably be very uncomfortable, both theologically and in terms of lifestyle. But these are images of our pioneers that we've idealized in our minds. And we don't like to talk about some of the things that are different. For example, the health message, they would probably be eating meat, and I'm sure they'd be eating unclean foods. Or William Miller, who liked to smoke. We don't tend to think or visualize him smoking his tobacco pipe while he's studying Daniel and Revelation, but he most certainly would have. Didn't make him a bad person. That's just who he
Right.
was. but we've kind of remade him into our own kind of image and idealized form that we would like to have. So these were real people. They had real struggles, and yet at the same time, God could use them. And I find that profoundly hopeful.
Let's talk about fundamentalism.
Sure.
There's a generic use of the term that we are discouraged from using now, but fundamentalism is a
Sure.
very specific movement in American Christianity. Tell us a little bit about it.
Absolutely. This is one of the great challenges is that terms and the words we use have meaning, and those meanings change over time. Certainly, I'm familiar with how some people can use fundamentalism in a pejorative way, just like, Islamic fundamentalist terrorist or whatever. Sometimes we'll hear that on the news in more recent years. And when I'm using the term fundamentalist, I'm not using it in a pejorative way whatsoever. That's not my intent. I'm using it as strictly in a historical sense. And the sense that I'm looking at is the turn of the early 20th century and American religion specifically. Now, there will be other forms and varieties of fundamentalism and evangelicalism in other parts of the world, but mostly I'm looking here in an Adventist in an American context. And so, yeah, the late 19th, early 20th century, you see a reactionary force within American Christianity to what they would have described as liberal inroads, the undermining of Christianity, the scientific dissection of scripture, the questioning of miracles, the questioning of even the all of these things that are really laying the groundwork. Even a creation, a literal creation. Did God actually create this world? And so the idea of evolution is undermining these things. Conservative Christians find themselves under siege, under threat. And so then they respond. And that response, what some people characterize as anti-modernism or this anti-liberal new theology, becomes known as the fundamentalists. And it's really because they publish a series of booklets called The Fundamentals. No surprise there. And this is part of the fun of this is these booklets are they kind of a catalyst. And that's part of it, and it's also partly it's the middle of World War I, and so they're concerned about the end of the world and Jesus coming. And the fundamentalists, by and large, are premillennialists. They're holding large prophecy conferences, and that certainly attracts the attention of Adventists to, hey, here's these conservative Christians, and they're doing a really great job at calling the attention of people about Christ's soon return. And it seems as if, from my perspective, that those Adventist church leaders are more than just a little bit jealous. And so that kind of sets the stage for Adventism really beginning to interact and engage with this wider fundamentalist movement, to the point where Adventists see themselves as fundamentalists. Some will even say we're the fundamentalists of the fundamentalists, or the true fundamentalists. And we see this certainly taking place.
So this reaction to modernism, to evolution, to probably the German higher critic, makes its way into the Adventist Church. Did the infamous booklets actually make their way into Adventism?
Well, the booklet's not as much, and I'm trying to see because I finally just this week got. I've been looking for original copies, and I just finally found the last one I was missing. So I finally have a complete
Oh, good.
original set. I'm a
Interesting.
collector, and I like these things. And Adventists really kind of ignored it, the fundamentals themselves. And I think that's largely because the main editor, Reuben Torrey, had written a tract against Adventists. He had had a tango with A.T. Jones, and so they weren't really getting along too well. He wasn't really so sure about Adventists, and Adventists weren't so sure about him. But by the time the prophecy conferences happened after that, and towards the end of World War I, you see a definite engagement by Adventists where church leaders and pastors are attending these prophecy conferences. They're writing about them on the front page of the review. And I think at that point, because you later see how they come back and revisit and talk about the fundamentals, those pamphlets. So I think the prophecy conferences, eschatology is the primary linking point. But there's those other aspects of theology that come along with it. And I mean, one obvious thing is that as they're interacting with these fundamentalists, they publish lists of fundamental beliefs, which Adventists look at, engage, and respond to. And our earliest 20th century statements of fundamental beliefs, I mean, you can go back to 1872 with Uriah Smith, but by 1931, you have a statement of fundamental beliefs in the Adventist Yearbook, right? And but that statement is really based on these earlier statements from 1918, 1919, engaging with the fundamentalists, and through the 1920s. And now, I mean, there's just a lot of work there that no one's ever really looked at. And they actually will republish the statements of fundamental beliefs by the fundamentalists and say, we believe all of this, except for we don't agree with them on the state of the dead. And one of them will even say, and this is actually going to have to be in my third volume, and make this into a trilogy, I suspect, where they actually openly embrace inerrancy, the inerrancy of Scripture, that we as Adventists fully support the fundamentalists. And so there's a republishing of the statement of fundamental beliefs with the first belief being inerrancy. So
and this is a departure from what some of the pioneers taught about the Scripture.
Yeah, so we're talking about change over time, Lauren, right? So you go back to the 1880s, you clearly see that Adventists reject this kind of rigid, narrow ways of interpreting inspired writings. Ellen White, the pioneers, had a much more flexible, what we call thought inspiration. And some people will kind of challenge me and say, well, you're against the fundamentalists. I'm not against the fundamentalists. There's good and bad in every historical movement. I don't see history as black and white in this kind of way. But this is one area that the idea that I wouldn't be a Christian believer if I didn't believe the Bible's divinely inspired, right? But at the same time, I find the whole concept of inerrancy and the authority of inspired writings to be most troubling. And I find that as an innovation, it's definitely going a different direction than the earliest Adventist pioneers in terms of how they viewed inspired writings and the authority of Scripture.
Well, let's talk about the engagement with the fundamentalists in the 1919 Bible Conference, which you
Sure.
wrote a whole book about. We tend to know the 1819 Bible Conference for a few concluding remarks about Ellen White that show that people already had questions about copying and inspiration. But you write in your book that the bulk of the conference was devoted to fundamentalism.
Yeah. And this was what was most surprising to me. I first pursued the 1919 Bible Conference in depth when I was a senior in college. Ben MacArthur was my professor in the history department there. And for our senior project, he challenged me. Normally we did Civil War projects, but that for me, he said, I want you to work on 1919. So I ended up reading through the minutes, and I did the best I could at the time as a senior in college. But it whetted my appetite. And what shocked me first was reading the conversations about Ellen White's writings at the very end of the conference, and then I went back to look through the rest of the minutes, and the majority of it had nothing to do with Ellen White. Really, it had to do with prophetic interpretation. And what I began to see in small relief at that moment was that there's a strong connection between the wider fundamentalist movement, eschatology, and Adventism. And where Ellen White comes in is, how do we solve those differences, those eschatological differences? And you have two different hermeneutics, or two different methods for interpreting inspired writings, and they wage war and do battle. They do battle royal, where the big guns doing battle with one another, to quote from the diary of one of the attendees. Okay. And so you have this sort of two different ways of interpreting inspired writings. Both sides see themselves as thoroughly fundamentalist, because I have yet to find any Adventists from 1910 to 1930 that would identify as modernist or liberal. No one does. No one. But within Adventism and within this Adventist fundamentalism, as I call it, you have this sort of reaction, this response, and you have these two polarizing groups that are going different ways and diverging in terms of what is the proper way to interpret inspired writings, and how do those inspired writings, how do you use Ellen White's writings in relationship to Scripture? This will be the defining, the nexus upon which they will disagree, and where we will see lots of controversy within Adventism, at least at 1919.
Before we go on, let me just ask you, you said eschatology was the link, and yet Seventh-day Adventists have a fairly singular eschatology. To what extent did the eschatology of the fundamentalists reflect the sort of Schofield Darby view? Was that coming into being at that time?
Well, it is. I mean, Darby goes all the way back, what, to the 1870s, 1880s, and he gains a lot of traction within conservative Christian circles by the 20th century. Schofield, the Schofield Bible that Oxford publishes, I think that's 1906. So certainly by the time World War I comes along, there's gaining momentum and popularity in terms of those ideas, dispensationalism, right? But not all fundamentalists are dispensationalists. There's actually a continuum. There's quite a bit of variety, and this is one of those points where it's like everyone says, "Yeah, Jesus is coming," and we kind of disagree on the specifics. I mean, some of you are dispensationalists, some are not. Let's not fight too much about this because we've got a lot of work to do in combating modernism and combating the new theology. And so Adventists kind of fit in there because obviously Adventists reject dispensationalism. And Adventists who attend these prophecy conferences acknowledge and say, well, yeah, there's kind of some disagreement on this point. We obviously reject dispensationalism like some of the other fundamentalists. So they see themselves still within this broader milieu of this mindset of fundamentalism. Although I will point out very quickly, though, that it's largely one-sided love affair for the Adventists. In fact, my 1919, I call it flirting. This is kind of this one-sided flirtation. They love fundamentalism. The fundamentalists, if you please, are not quite so sure about Adventists. Obviously, Reuben Torrey doesn't like them at all. Some are not quite so anti-Adventists and urge more caution, just kind of leave them alone. So they're never like, our church leaders are never invited to speak at these big events, but we always consistently have Adventists attending them, taking careful notes and reporting back to the Adventist church saying, hey, this is great. This is great. F.M. Wilcox, he says these are some of the most important events in all of Christian history, right up there with Luther's 95 Theses. So that's their editor of the review, front page of the review reporting on these things. So you see, it's a very yeah, they loved it and saw themselves within that mind.
So there's actually some ecumenical engagement going on there.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a sidelight, but we actually probably in the 19th century, early 20th century, are much more ecumenical in terms of the idea that dialoguing with leaders of other denominations. You see this all the way back to the 1870s. I've written about the dialogues that early Adventists had with the Seventh-day Baptists and started exchanging delegates. James and Ellen White were behind that, Lauren, and Advent Christian. So you see if there are other people that are religious leaders that have questions or similarities, Adventists are dialoguing with them. And that's pretty huge.
Well, let's move on up to 1922 now, the subject of your latest book. All of this set the scene for what happened at the General Conference in 1922.
Absolutely. The 1922, what I'm doing is the rest of the story. 1919 was my dissertation topic, and so I took a break, and then the last few years revisited that and kind of got excited and found some new material, which is what historians do. We're always finding new stuff. It's kind of a never-ending process, right? And so 1922 was kind of like the aftermath. What happened next? And so I've just enjoyed this. Is like my COVID project. You lock a historian up. What do you do during COVID? You're stuck at home and can only teach online classes. So what I started doing is I backed up to about 1918, started reading through page by page through the review and the signs, And so kind of started looking at that aftermath story leading up to 1922, which is this pivotal General Conference session, probably one of the most controversial in all of Adventist history and probably one of the least known.
What makes it pivotal?
Well, it's pivotal in the sense that it became a defining moment. And by the way, 1922 is defining for the fundamentalists. They have the World Christian Fundamentals Association. They have a whole series of things that happen within the fundamentalist movement that help it to coalesce into a more defined movement. And Adventism, it seems to be a turning point. Our church leadership changes. Daniels, who'd been GC president for 21 years, you have a lot of people that are attacking him. So you have a kind of basically a shakeup of church leadership, although he becomes the secretary, but he's no longer the paramount. He's not the kingpin, so to speak, as GC president. So clearly everyone recognizes there's a changing of the guard, even though it's done very delicately to not shame him or anything like that. And in 22, I kind of see as not only do you have all the drama of what unfolds at that GC session, but after that, you really see it's a different climate. The literature that the church is producing, whereas in 1919, you see that there's two sides struggling with each other. By the time we get to 22, it's pretty much Adventism has moved into full-on what I call Adventist fundamentalism. There's still a few exceptions. Ellen White's son, W.C. White's always this kind of moderating voice in the background, but he's in the background, right? And so what I see is through the rest of the 20s is this kind of Adventist fundamentalism that takes precedence. And so that kind of, I guess you might say that conservative, very rigid and militant way of approaching inspired writings, and that hermeneutic really takes the ascendancy through the rest of the 1920s. The interesting thing about Adventism is there's always these appeals to be less militant. Those that are too militant, too feisty, kind of are put at arm's length at the margins. And I'm thinking especially of Washburn and Holmes, who they just were a little bit too caustic for church leaders. So, but yeah, the 1920s, the theology that is being espoused in the 1920s, and this is where I'm going to have to do some more work. I had more material I wasn't able to include in this 22 book, which will probably end up becoming a trilogy, is looking at the origins of last generation theology. I can now historically pinpoint the origins. A lot of people point to M.L. Andreasen, and of course there's always some earlier antecedents with maybe like Wagner and stuff, but he ends up leaving the denomination. And so how did this last generation theology really become prominent in Adventism? And I would argue the connecting point, the connecting link is fundamentalism. It can be historically documented. And this is very, from a historian's point of view, this is very exciting because this didn't just happen tabula rasa out of nothing. There had to have been something, some forces, centrifugal forces that were kind of all coming together. And so what I see is fundamentalism through the rest of the 20s, talking about that shift. And so I see 22 as sort of this tipping point, perhaps. Yeah. And after that, through the rest of the 20s, you just see a strong emphasis on inerrancy, strong emphasis on what we would today call last generation theology. They would have used other terms, but the ideas were there.
You talk in 1922 about race and gender.
Yeah.
And how that developed during that conference. Let's take that as a sort of last topic here. We don't want to give your whole book away. We want people to order it and read it.
Yeah, so a big part of my thesis is how did fundamentalism change Adventism, this so-called Adventist fundamentalism? And I say it changed Adventism in two profound ways. Not just two, but these are indeed two significant aspects. And so race and gender, our earliest pioneers were abolitionists. There's a lot of good work that's been done in more recent years. For example, Kevin Burton's work pointing and highlighting all the way back to the Millerites, how socially progressive a lot of our pioneers were. And then you get to the 1930s and 40s where the General Conference and most of our schools are segregated, right? We end up having regional conferences. So in the 1920s, you actually see some people articulating a theology of a black and white heaven, of a segregated heaven. How could we go from being abolitionist to a segregated heaven? that to me baffles my mind, right? And the connecting point, I think that obviously, like all of history, it's complicated. It's not just one thing. It's never just one thing. But I think probably the most significant catalyst for that reversal in terms of our views of race is fundamentalism. And you certainly see that within the wider fundamentalist movement, where there's Frank Norris and others that are becoming enamored with even the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. I recently did some work on that, an article that I published in Spectrum on Adventists and the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, the second wave of the Klan. There's definitely these connecting links that are there. And so, yeah, I'm basically arguing fundamentalism. I don't talk too much about race in my 1922 book. I do set some of the stage. I'm mostly focused on fundamentalism, but I do try to make the case that this is one of those reversals. The other reversal is in terms of gender. In 1910, there's close to 1,000 women who are in leadership as pastors and some kind of, you see a different kind of Adventism. I tell my students this in class, and they're always like, well, if that was true, why don't we know about them? And I said, well, it's because nobody's told their stories.
Yeah.
So this last year, I've taken my other COVID project has been to write about 50 women whose stories have never been told before. And to write
give
those
a little
stories.
advertisement here for Jim Wiverding, doing narrative sort of work on telling the stories of some of these women. He presented it to our Adventist Today Sabbath seminar, and it was very, very well received.
He's doing great work, and he's also probably one of my, I would say, one of my best friends. I appreciate him and Laura very much. They're doing great scholarship. And we're just, again, there's just so much room for work here, right? I mean, I don't even feel like we're stepping on each other's toes, because he's finding all these women that I haven't heard about, and I'm finding a ton of all these ladies, because there's stories there that need telling. They need to be rediscovered, and they need to be told. Anyways, there's close to 1,000 women in 1910. By 1930, there's basically none. Again, reversal. Part of it is within fundamentalist rhetoric is a reifying of specific gender norms, that a woman's place is in the home, cooking food, barefoot and pregnant kind of thing, right? This 19th century cult of domesticity. Yeah, so there's all these gender manuals and norms that begin to be published by the fundamentalists in the 1920s, and they look awfully similar, like the same gender kind of manuals and guides that are published by Adventists in literature and articles about the home in Adventist circles. And I would say it's not just women. It's not just women. There's also, I think my favorite chapter in the book is about a toxic view of masculinity too, right? So the muscular Christianity movement, very popular among fundamentalists. Adventists are using the same rhetoric, the same examples, same idealized norms of gender. And this contributes to this reversal. So you have a reversal in race and gender. Obviously, my book is trying to look broader at Adventist fundamentalism overall and the theology, but I do try to make the point, and I think it's not too difficult to do, because there's just such a rich evidence of it, that fundamentalism is the most significant catalyst for this reversal in terms of race and gender.
I guess it seems pretty apparent that a lot of these things that started in the 1920s have continued to echo down to the present moment.
No doubt, because the stories of our past shape and inform our present. They're part of our identity. And therefore, by going back and studying our history, we can better be attuned to how the past has shaped the present. And that's a hopeful reality, that we do history not just so we can dig up facts, but so that we can hopefully live better informed lives and be faithful to our Adventist identity, our heritage, and I hope even our calling.
One of the questions that people will often raise is how did an organization that started with a very strong and articulate female leader become an organization that doesn't ordain women? Yeah, I think what you're discovering here and what you're telling us, this shift, this evolution, helps us to understand that, doesn't it?
I hope so. That's part of what we try to do as historians, is uncover the past, and we find the good and the bad, and we celebrate the good, and those challenging moments we hopefully can learn from them.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. And I really appreciate your giving me the time. And I wish you best of luck on this book, and perhaps encourage people to read the 1919 book as well. We'll put links up for these two books. This is Lauren Seibel for Adventists Today. I've been talking with Michael Campbell. Michael, we'll pick this up again when you write your third volume.
Thanks so much.